It happened on a Friday. I was working on a report for the newspaper where I was a staff reporter. My assignment had brought me to the north of Italy, to a secluded place, the Santa Clara Monastery, located on the slopes of the Alps. Founded back in the 12th century, the monastery was known for its strict discipline and ancient traditions. Thick stone walls and dark arches created a sense of eternity, hiding ancient secrets within. It felt as if the cold wind sweeping over these harsh lands pierced deep into the soul. I was filming a report about the life of the monks, silence, prayers, labor in the vineyards. But my main focus was on the local priests who were performing a special mission in this remote corner of the world. That evening, I was in the office of Father Giovanni, an elderly priest with a tired yet attentive gaze. The dim candlelight barely illuminated his stern features, and the scent of old books and incense hung in the air around us. As we talked, a quiet knock on the door suddenly interrupted our conversation. Father Giovanni, lifting his head, responded, allowing the guest to enter. The door slowly creaked open, and in the doorway appeared a monk. It was Deacon Luca. Tall, thin, with a pale face, he looked like a ghost against the dark corridor behind him. Standing beside him was a man in his 40s, who clearly wasn't from around here. The man had a sturdy build, his face weathered by the sun and time, with deep wrinkles etched near his eyes. His rough hands, marked by calluses and cracked skin, spoke of a hard life. He wore simple village clothes, a dark jacket, worn pants, and heavy boots. He looked like a typical farmer, most likely from one of those harsh alpine villages where people live in a constant struggle with nature. He bowed slightly, pressing his hat to his chest, and introduced himself in a hoarse voice. "My name is Marco. I'm from a small village called San Lorenzo in the Alps. I'm sorry to trouble you, Father, but I need your help." His eyes revealed how exhausted he was, and his face bore the marks of despair. He looked as though he hadn't slept for many nights, and anxiety had taken root deep within him. Father Giovanni, noticing his state, stood and gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Marco. You seem to be in great trouble. I'll listen to you. This is my friend." He nodded in my direction. "A reporter who's studying our work. Will you mind if he stays?" Marco shook his head, his eyes dimming even further. "No, Father," he replied quietly. "I no longer care who hears. I've come for help." The man sat heavily in the offered chair, his hands clenched into fists, clearly trying to gather his thoughts. Several minutes passed in tense silence before he finally began to speak. "Forgive me, Father," his voice faltered, as if he was afraid of what he was about to say. "But I have a problem. I think my wife is possessed by a demon. Several people have already died. She holds our entire village in fear. The police investigated, but they found no direct evidence. But I know it's her. Something happened to her, and now she's not who she used to be. I beg you, help me." Father Giovanni, folding his arms across his chest, looked at Marco with a long, thoughtful gaze. His eyes glowed with some inner strength, as if he had seen many such tragedies in his life. "A demon," he finally said quietly, as though testing the word on his tongue. "That's a serious accusation, Marco. But if it's true, you've come to the right place. The Lord will not abandon you in your time of need. We will help you. But first, start from the beginning. Tell us everything that has happened." Marco hesitated before he began to speak. It was as though he had sunk into his dark thoughts, his gaze fixed in the void. When I looked into his eyes, I didn't just see exhaustion. I saw something more ancient, more primal: fear. the kind familiar to anyone who has come face to face with something inexplicable. It was the kind of fear that grips you when you wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move, too scared to even breathe, because you feel an unseen presence close by. Marco's eyes radiated that fear, as if he was standing face to face with something far more powerful and cruel than anyone could imagine. Finally, his lips trembled, and he began to speak, as if each word took a tremendous effort. "My wife, we lived peacefully," he said, lowering his gaze to the floor. "We married for love, as people do when they're young, full of hope for the future. We had a small farm, and while we weren't wealthy, we had everything we needed." Marco sighed, his face darkening as if the weight of the past pressed heavily on his shoulders. "One day, everything changed. My wife came back from the woods, and she wasn't the same. She became withdrawn. She wouldn't look me in the eye, kept to herself. She started saying more and more that she needed to go to the woods, and she would disappear at night. I tried to talk to her, tried to find out what was going on, but she just brushed it off, said she was fine." His voice grew quieter, as if the memories of that time caused him pain. "Then strange things started happening," he continued, nervously rubbing his hands together. "At first, a few chickens disappeared. The neighbors and I thought it was wolves. But then the goats and sheep started to vanish. And this wasn't the same. We found tracks, but they were unnatural. Wolves don't hunt like that. Whatever it was, this creature was something else. People in the village began whispering about a monster." Marco paused, as if reliving the horror of those events. "The longer it went on, the worse things got. People started finding the mutilated bodies of animals at the edge of the forest, and then our shepherd, Antonio," his voice wavered, "found a dead man. His name was Silvio. We all knew him. He was kind and cheerful. But what we saw, my God, it wasn't just an animal attack. It was something inhuman. His body was torn to shreds, as if someone, or something, had toyed with him before killing him." I felt a chill run down my spine. Marco shuddered, his breathing growing heavier, as if telling the story made him relive the terror. "The village was gripped with fear," he continued. "There was no more laughter. People locked themselves in their homes, afraid to go out after sunset. No one wanted to believe the terrible rumors, but everyone could feel that evil was near." Marco slowly lifted his eyes and looked directly at Father Giovanni. "But the worst thing happened when one morning I found my wife on the doorstep of our house." Marco's voice grew quieter, as if he was afraid to say it aloud. "She was covered in dirt, her clothes stained with blood. I woke her up and tried to find out what happened, but she remembered nothing. Nothing. She looked at me with empty eyes and said she didn't know what had happened. And then I realized that this wasn't just an illness. A demon had possessed her." His face contorted with pain and fear, as though he had lost the last fragments of hope. "I ran to her relatives, tried to ask them what was going on, but they said nothing. They just avoided my eyes. I think they knew from the very beginning. Something's wrong here, Father. I can feel it. I see it in their looks. And now I'm here, in front of you. I can't do this anymore. She's not my wife anymore. I'm afraid of her, and I'm afraid for her." He fell silent, and the room plunged into a heavy, oppressive silence. The flickering shadows cast by the candle seemed alive, wrapping around the walls as if absorbing every word Marco had spoken. I saw Father Giovanni tense for a moment, taking a deep breath, and then he spoke, his voice soft but resolute. "Marco," said the priest, gazing intently at the man, You are not alone in this trial. Your fear is understandable, and your story is filled with pain. But know this: God sees you. And if your wife is truly possessed, my brothers and I will do everything we can to free her. Demons are strong, but the power of God is stronger. The man seemed to calm down after Father Giovanni's words, as if the weight that had been pressing on his soul had finally lifted. I sat there, watching this scene, unable to believe my eyes. Could this be real? No, it couldn't be. But Marco's story was so convincing that a growing fear began to take root inside me, mixed with a strange sense of curiosity. My journalistic instincts kicked in, and I realized I couldn't just stand by. I had to be part of this, to uncover everything, no matter what the cost. Father Giovanni asked Marco a few more clarifying questions, his voice soft but insistent, as if trying to extract every detail. Then, after calming the guest, he offered him one of the monastery's cells to rest and regain his strength. Marco, clearly exhausted, thanked him, and bowing left with Deacon Luca, who guided him to his room. When the door closed behind them, I turned to the priest, burning with determination. Firmly, almost defiantly, I said, "I have to go with you." Father Giovanni looked at me carefully, his gaze both calm and concerned. "This could be dangerous," he said slowly, as if weighing each word. "So I'd prefer if you declined." But I wasn't going to back down. I had heard too much to just stand aside now. "You're not getting rid of me," I replied, feeling my resolve growing stronger with every word. The priest sighed wearily, understanding that persuading me otherwise was futile. His eyes closed briefly, as if seeking an answer in prayer. "If you insist, perhaps it is God's will," he finally said. "No one can stop you." And so, we began our preparations. Father Giovanni sent a request to the bishop for permission to perform the exorcism, and then he busied himself with getting ready for the journey. It took the rest of the day. We knew we were facing a long and difficult road, and we needed to prepare everything, from religious items to warm clothes for the mountain trek. The next morning, we set off as soon as the sun began to rise over the mountains. I offered to drive in my small jeep, and the priest agreed without hesitation. The road, winding through the narrow alpine switchbacks, took about 3 hours. As we climbed higher, the landscape changed. The slopes grew steeper, the forests darker, and the air colder. Dense spruces and pines stood like silent sentinels along the road, their crowns touching the sky and blocking the light. Eventually, the road came to an end, and before us stretched an off-road path. The tall, forested hills gave way to rugged, rocky slopes. Here, nature was wild, untouched by civilization. We had to leave the vehicle behind and continue on foot. We grabbed our backpacks and began hiking along a narrow trail that wound its way through the rocks. Step by step, we ventured deeper into the mountains. The path was difficult. The stones underfoot were slippery from recent rains, and the air grew thinner. The cold seeped into our bones despite the warm clothes we wore. Occasionally we heard a rustling sound around us, whether it was the wind playing in the branches or hidden animals tracking our steps. I couldn't tell. It felt as if the forest was alive, watching us, whispering in a language invisible and incomprehensible to man. "It's as if the mountains themselves don't want us to go any further," I muttered, barely suppressing a shiver. These places stirred a strange sense of unease within me. Father Giovanni walked ahead, his stride confident, but I noticed he occasionally glanced over his shoulder, as if he too felt the presence of something foreign and dangerous. "This place has been isolated from the world for a long time," he said quietly. "Not only people live here, but shadows of the past as well. We walked for hours, and each step felt heavier than the last. Time seemed to slow down, and the mountains themselves pulled us back, reluctant to let us enter this forgotten village. The closer we got to our destination, the darker the landscape became. The sun, barely breaking through the clouds, no longer warmed us, only casting longer shadows. The mountain peaks towered around us like giant sentinels, locking us in this stone prison. Finally, the first houses of the village appeared in the distance, low, dilapidated buildings with stone walls and moss-covered roofs. San Lorenzo looked abandoned, even though its inhabitants still lived here. The air was thick with the sense of decay and fear, as if the place itself was cursed. No one greeted us at the entrance. It seemed as though the villagers had hidden behind their doors, too afraid to come outside. We followed Marco, and as I looked around, I could feel an invisible force pressing in on me from all sides. The houses, grim and gray, stood as silent sentinels of this village. But I noticed eyes peeking out from windows and doors, secretly watching us. It seemed as if the villagers, like animals, were hiding in their shelters, fearful of every unfamiliar step. It felt like we had stepped into another world, a world ruled by fear and despair. Even the arrival of a priest, a symbol of salvation and hope, didn't bring them any relief. They continued to watch us, but made no move to come out and greet us. It was an eerie sight, their silent, ghostly figures hiding in their homes, as if they knew that something dark was approaching. I couldn't shake the feeling that something ominous hung in the air of this village, something unspoken, which made every movement heavy. It was as if the very ground here was soaked in fear. "Do the villagers know about your wife?" I asked, feeling anxiety tightening in my chest. Marco shook his head without looking up. "No," he replied quietly, his voice trembling. "I've kept it hidden. Otherwise, they'd have torn us apart. People here trust no one, especially when it comes to something dark." His words made me freeze. How could he have hidden such strange events? I doubted his words. In such a small village, everything should have been visible. But soon, I realized that Marco and his wife didn't live in the village itself, but a little farther away, at the foot of the hills. He had been avoiding contact with others lately, which allowed him to keep things hidden. We passed through the village and came upon a small house that looked like a shadow of its former self. The stone walls were covered in moss, and a fence, once likely used for goats, stretched around the property. There had once been a small garden here, but now its overgrown beds were only a faint reminder of the life that once thrived. Everything seemed abandoned, as if time had come to a halt in this place. Marco opened the creaking door first, and we stepped inside. Deacon Luca entered first, followed by Father Giovanni, and finally, I crossed the threshold of this strange house. As soon as I entered, a heavy silence fell over the room. Everyone suddenly stopped. I froze, trying to understand what was happening. In the dim light filtering through the small windows, I saw a chilling sight. On the floor, tied to a metal bed frame with rough ropes, sat a woman. She looked like a shadow of her former self. Her face was pale and gaunt, as if all the strength had drained from her body. Dark circles surrounded her eyes, and her once probably tidy hair hung in dirty strands, nearly obscuring her bruised, exhausted face. The wounds on her arms and legs suggested she had tried to free herself but failed. When she lifted her head and met my gaze, I saw something in her eyes that pierced my heart. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep sense of helplessness in the face of something she couldn't control. Her lips trembled as though she wanted to speak, but the words were caught in her throat. In that moment, I felt genuine pity for her. I realized that I wasn't looking at a monster, but at a person, broken by horror, consumed by some ancient evil. Father Giovanni paused for a moment, bowing his head in prayer before kneeling beside her. He gently touched her hand, and with his voice barely steady, he asked, "Are you all right?" The woman barely lifted her eyes to him and nodded. But in that nod, there was so much pain and fear that even this silent gesture of agreement felt like a cry for help. After this, Father Giovanni carefully examined Maria. He gently lifted her hands, checked her wounds, and with a clear sense of relief said, "It seems there are no serious injuries." He was about to untie the ropes when Marco, standing behind us, suddenly stiffened and spoke anxiously. "Don't do that. She might run away." The priest froze for a moment, then slowly turned to Maria. His gaze was soft but penetrating, like someone who could see far deeper than mere words. "Maria," he said quietly, "I'm going to untie you. But you won't try to run, will you?" Maria, sitting on the floor with a pale face, nodded again, this time a bit more confidently, though there was still a deep confusion in her eyes. Without hesitating further, Father Giovanni untied her, and Deacon Luca immediately brought a glass of water. Maria drank it greedily, as if she hadn't had water in days. Still absorbed by the scene, I turned to Marco, feeling the need for more information, and asked, "You haven't been here for several days, and she's been tied up this whole time?" Marco lowered his gaze and answered with bitterness in his voice. "Her mother was watching over her while I was gone. I suppose she's already left." They took turns, her mother, sometimes her brother. I couldn't leave her alone. But he hesitated, then added, "My wife, she's not the same as before. She can't be left unsupervised." After Maria regained some strength, Father Giovanni began to speak to her, his voice gentle, like a father talking to a lost child. "Maria," he began softly, sitting on the edge of the bed, "tell us what happened. It all started with the woods, didn't it?" She averted her gaze again, as if trying to find the answer within herself. Her face twisted with pain and fear, as if fragments of memory were surfacing, but she couldn't piece them together. "Yes," she whispered. "I went into the woods. I often went there alone to gather herbs. But that day, I don't remember. Everything was normal, and then darkness. I woke up at home, but from that day on, something changed. I feel like something is following me. At first it was just thoughts, but then strange things started happening. I became sad. Everything around me grew bleak, and I always feel drawn back to the woods, as if it's calling me. And then, blood. I don't know what's happening. I tried talking to my mother, but she only cries. No one will tell me what's going on, and I'm afraid." Father Giovanni listened in silence, his face motionless. But it was clear he was deep in thought. It seemed as though each detail of her story was forming a picture in his mind, though the picture was just as frightening as the story itself. "Do you pray, Maria?" he asked gently. I try," she whispered. "But something inside me resists. It's like a wall, as if someone is keeping me from reaching God." "Let's pray together," said Father Giovanni. He knelt beside the bed and took her hand. The priest began to pray quietly but confidently, his voice like a light in the darkness of that house. The prayer filled the room, cleansing the air of the heavy atmosphere. Maria repeated the words after him, her voice trembling, but gradually she calmed down. And then, as soon as the prayer ended, her eyes began to close. She fell asleep so quickly it seemed as if her body was so exhausted that even a brief moment of peace allowed her to surrender to sleep. We gently laid her on the bed, and Father Giovanni quietly made the sign of the cross over her. "She will find peace in prayer," he said softly, then turned to the deacon. "Luca, let's begin the preparations." Deacon Luca immediately started preparing holy water and other necessary items for the rite. The room fell into silence again, but it was a different kind of silence now, a more unsettling one, the silence before the storm. "But before we begin," the priest said, looking out the window where dusk was beginning to fall, "we need to visit her relatives. I don't believe they've told us the whole truth. They may be hiding something more." We left Deacon Luca to watch over Maria and headed to visit her relatives. Marco silently led the way, his shoulders tense, and with each step, it became clear that he wasn't eager to go there. His face showed signs of inner conflict, as though he knew this visit wouldn't bring anything good. We crossed through the village again and soon found ourselves in front of one of the most imposing houses, standing out among the others. It was a solid, well-off home made of dark stone, with tall windows covered by heavy wooden shutters. The walls were covered in moss, and the roof was tiled, looking relatively new. Unlike the other dilapidated structures, this house appeared almost majestic against the backdrop of the village's poverty. Marco stopped at the door, took a deep breath, and knocked several times. From inside we heard shuffling footsteps, and soon an old, sharp and irritated voice called out, "Who is it?" Marco, lifting his head slightly, responded, "It's me, Marco. Signora Anna, please open up." We heard more slow steps as the person inside struggled to cover the short distance to the door. The door slowly creaked open, revealing an elderly woman. This was Maria's grandmother, a short, hunched woman with gray hair tightly pulled into a bun. Her face was deeply wrinkled, as if each crease carried memories of past hardships. Her eyes looked at us with suspicion, but when she saw the priest, her face momentarily twisted with an expression of fear. She bowed, hesitantly shifting her gaze between me and Father Giovanni, and addressed Marco. "What do you want?" Her voice trembled, but there was an underlying exhaustion and irritation. Marco sighed heavily and said, "Signora, the father wants to speak with you." The old woman gave us another long, assessing look, as if weighing whether or not to let strangers inside. But finally, she nodded and invited us in. We entered the house, and the first thing that caught my eye was the wealth and decor. In contrast to Marco's simple home, this house was furnished with heavy wooden furniture, carpets, and antique paintings hung on the walls. The floors were covered in beautiful tile. Everything looked well kept and solid. This family clearly knew no hardship. We made our way to the kitchen, where the old woman offered us seats at a large table covered with a lace tablecloth. She began brewing tea, her movements slow but precise. The room filled with the scent of fresh herbs. At this point, Marco, perhaps deciding not to delay the conversation, asked, "Is Signora Angelina not at home? And where's Lorenzo?" The old woman's movement slowed slightly, and she answered with apparent indifference, "She's gone to the woods, and her son is at work. They're busy with their own matters." Her voice sounded distant, as if this wasn't her home, but some faraway place. Then Father Giovanni, who had been silent until now, decided to speak. His voice was gentle but carried a sense of authority. "My name is Father Giovanni," he introduced himself. "We've come to learn what happened to your granddaughter. Could you tell us more about what you know? Perhaps you can help us understand." The old woman suddenly froze. Her hands holding the teapot shook slightly. Her eyes flashed with worry, but she quickly looked away, as though trying to hide her reaction. I don't know anything, Father," she said, shaking her head, as if warding off an invisible attack. "This is a tragedy for our family, but I don't know what happened. We're just praying for her." I watched her closely, and despite her protests, it was obvious. She was hiding something. Her trembling hands, the way she avoided our eyes, her uncertain words, everything pointed to her knowing more than she was saying. Father Giovanni observed her intently, but didn't press, giving her the chance to open up on her own. However, no matter how we tried, the old woman stubbornly held her ground, denying any knowledge or involvement in what had happened to Maria. After several attempts to coax more information out of her, we realized we wouldn't get anything else. The old woman remained a mystery, guarding her secret more tightly than the walls of that house. As we stepped out of the house and back into the cold, fresh air, Marco finally spoke. He looked defeated, and there was bitterness in his voice. "That family never liked me," he admitted. "They were against our marriage. They thought I was too poor and unworthy of their daughter. I know they still can't accept that Maria chose me." I glanced back at the house, which still loomed behind us, a symbol of their wealth and pride. I noticed the stark contrast between the well-to-do estate of her family and Marco's modest home. It deepened my understanding of why they might have rejected him. Here, among these old walls, lay not only a secret but also a deep divide between two families. When we returned, Maria had already woken up and was quietly talking to Deacon Luca. She seemed to be in better condition, though she still looked exhausted. Marco immediately rushed over to her, anxiously asking, "Are you okay, Maria?" She nodded, giving him a faint smile. "Yes, I'm feeling better." I stood a little off to the side, watching this scene, and suddenly I found myself lost in thought. If you think about it rationally, all of this looked like a typical case of domestic abuse, or perhaps a mental disorder in the woman. The fact that her husband tied her to the bed should have been the first sign to call the police. Yet somehow, that thought hadn't even crossed my mind. Maybe it was because of the mysterious atmosphere that permeated this house and the village. I realized that I had fully immersed myself in this world, a world where logic and reason retreated before something far more ancient and inexplicable. From an outsider's perspective, it might seem unprofessional, and deep down, I reproached myself for it. But if you were here, I think you would also feel that dark force that seemed to envelop this place. Perhaps there were some magnetic anomalies typical of mountainous regions, or maybe it was the influence of some other natural phenomenon if one were to think scientifically. But for now, I decided to observe, to see what would happen next. I approached Father Giovanni and asked, "What do you plan to do tonight?" The priest responded quietly but confidently, "Tonight we will pray and observe. I want to understand what happens to her at night before drawing any conclusions about her condition. We need to know what we're dealing with before we rush into battle." His words struck me. I realized how wise and experienced this man was. He didn't rush in head first, didn't immediately blame demons, but sought to understand the nature of what was happening. Father Giovanni was someone who sought truth through observation and prayer. As it began to grow dark outside, I noticed Marco becoming nervous. He approached me and said, "We need to tie Maria up. If we don't, she'll run away." I raised my eyebrows and asked him, "What do you mean? Why are you so sure?" Marco, nervously glancing at his wife, spoke quietly. "Before this, she ran away every night. I didn't know what was happening. But one night, when I tied her up, I saw something that will stay with me forever." Something happened to her at night that filled me with horror and fear. That's when I realized she is possessed by a demon. We listened carefully, and after a brief pause, Father Giovanni nodded, making his decision. He approached Maria and asked her in a soft but firm voice, "Maria, do you mind if we tie you up again? It's for your safety." She didn't resist and, shaking her head, quietly replied, "It's okay. Tie me up. It's necessary." As if it were something normal for her, she calmly lay down on the bed, and Marco and Deacon Luca tied her hands and feet with soft but secure ropes. Candles were lit in the room, their warm light casting long shadows on the walls. Luca fastened a large crucifix above the bed, securing it tightly to the wall. The light from the candles and the crucifix became symbols of protection in the room, which was now thick with anxiety and the expectation of something sinister. Father Giovanni and Deacon Luca sat around the bed and began to pray. Their voices were soft but confident, as if every spoken syllable held the power to banish darkness. Marco sat beside his wife, never taking his eyes off her. In his gaze, I saw terror and helplessness, as if he had no idea what to expect from this night. Time passed slowly. I sat in a chair nearby, watching them. In my hands, I held a recorder, documenting every sound, every word. Today is October 3rd, 1985. It's now 11 p.m. The priests continue to pray, their voices growing stronger. Maria lies on the bed, unmoving. Her breathing seemed steady, but something about her stillness made me think that the storm hadn't begun yet. Marco remained at her side, his eyes glistening with fear, awaiting something dreadful, something that was bound to happen tonight. And then, when the silence became almost unbearable, I felt something shift in the air. Suddenly, the silence was broken by Maria's voice, loud and desperate. "Please, let me go." The priest, hearing her, continued praying, but then quietly and calmly asked, "Why do you want us to let you go, Maria?" She was gasping for breath, her voice trembling. "I feel sick. Please, I need to leave." Father Giovanni didn't stop praying, but responded with unwavering confidence. "It's safe here. We're with you, Maria. Don't worry. We'll take care of you." But Maria didn't seem to be listening. Her tone grew sharper, almost angry, as if she was losing control of her words and emotions. "Let me go." Her voice became more strained, as if every moment she stayed in this room caused her unbearable pain. She thrashed, trying to break free, her body twisting on the bed while the priests continued their prayers, their faces focused and calm. But Marco couldn't handle it. He was trembling, gripping her hands, trying to calm her. "Quiet, Maria, please. We're here. We'll help you." I watched the whole scene with wide eyes, my hands instinctively clenching around the recorder that continued to capture everything. Terror slowly clouded my mind, preventing me from focusing on anything other than the horrifying scene unfolding before me. And then, I smelled something. It was sharp, as if something nearby was burning. Panic gripped my heart and I started looking around, thinking that the candles might have set something on fire. But there was nothing. No flames. The smell didn't go away, only intensified. And suddenly I realized it wasn't the smell of burning. It was something else. The smell of sulfur. Rotten eggs. My mind flashed to the memory that sulfur is often associated with demonic manifestations. But where was it coming from? While I was lost in these thoughts, Maria suddenly fell silent. Her body went limp. Her head dropped weakly onto the pillow. She was like a hollow shell, as if all her energy had been drained in just a few minutes. The room plunged into a deafening silence, like the calm before a storm. I resumed recording on the device. But then a sharp knock came from outside the house. It was so loud and unexpected that I jumped, fear hitting me like a punch to the chest. I looked around, my heart racing, but the priests continued praying, as if nothing had happened. They didn't acknowledge it. But Marco and I, we were both startled. I saw Marco tense up, his face pale, and he quietly said, "We need to check what that was." We quickly left the house, opening the heavy wooden door, which creaked as it swung open before us. The moon shone brightly, its light so strong that it seemed as though the stars had lost their glow. I glanced at the sky. The moon was nearly full, only a couple of days until the full moon. Its cold light illuminated the surroundings, casting an eerie stillness over everything. The wind had stopped, and the silence was so tense it felt like the calm before a storm. We stepped out into the yard, slowly scanning our surroundings. Not a sound, no movement. It seemed like nature itself had fallen silent in anticipation of something. We circled the house, checked the dark corners of the yard, but found nothing. No sign of any living creature, no trace that someone had been nearby. Returning to the house, we saw that the priests were still praying, not pausing for even a second. I sat back in my chair, but the tension within me wouldn't let go. Every muscle in my body felt like a taut string. I couldn't take my eyes off Maria, watching every movement she made as she lay still. And then, something strange happened. The glass on the table next to me started to move. At first, it was barely noticeable, as if someone invisible was trying to push it telepathically. I stared at it, not believing what I was seeing. It wasn't a sudden movement, but slow and hesitant. The glass moved across the table, as if someone was trying to push it, but couldn't gather enough strength. But after a few seconds, it began to move faster with more force. And suddenly the glass slid off the edge of the table and crashed to the floor, shattering into tiny pieces. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the room, and I felt something snap inside me. My heart clenched with fear. Cold sweat covered my face, and my hands began to tremble. The fear dug deeper into me, filling every cell of my body. Marco and I exchanged worried glances, but the priests, once again, seemed to ignore what had just happened. Father Giovanni continued praying, his face focused and impassive, as if the events unfolding before him were routine. I noticed that Deacon Luca would occasionally turn his head towards the sounds and strange occurrences. But as soon as he saw Father Giovanni unwavering in his prayer, he quickly returned to the ritual, repeating the words after the priest. I tried to make sense of what was happening, but everything I had known up until this moment suddenly crumbled. I had always been a skeptic, never believing in the supernatural, but now I was witnessing a scene that would forever divide my life into before and after. My mind continued to resist, desperately searching for rational explanations. Could someone be hiding in the house, pulling strings and orchestrating this spectacle? But we were in a remote place, far from civilization, and the likelihood of this being some kind of prank seemed more and more unlikely. Suddenly, another unexpected event occurred. The blanket covering Maria was yanked off and fell to the floor, as if someone had forcibly ripped it away. My heart raced even faster. My breathing grew heavy and uneven. At that moment, Maria opened her eyes and began to look at us. But it wasn't the same gaze I had seen before. It was a look filled with predatory wariness, as if a beast was observing its prey. Maria's eyes showed no humanity. They were empty, cold, and that coldness pierced me to my core. I felt fear tightening its grip on me. But soon she closed her eyes again and calmed down, as if it had all been an illusion. After that, The night passed relatively peacefully, without further incidents. By morning, Maria woke up, once again resembling the person she had been before. She looked at us in surprise, as if she didn't remember anything that had happened during the night. We didn't explain anything to her, just gave her water and food to help her regain her strength. Father Giovanni looked exhausted, unsurprisingly, as he had prayed all night without stopping. I approached him and asked, "What conclusions have you drawn?" The priest, closing his eyes slightly, nodded thoughtfully. "It's definitely a demon. This evil is not of this world. We must prepare carefully. I think tomorrow night we'll attempt an exorcism." He paused, taking a deep breath, and added, "But first, we need to regain our strength. This will be a difficult battle." I nodded, understanding the seriousness of his words. We began preparing the place for the night's ritual, and then everyone, even Marco, who hadn't slept all night, finally managed to get some rest. I woke up around 3 in the afternoon. The room was bathed in soft light, and I immediately noticed that someone else was here. Sitting next to Maria was a woman in her 50s. Her hair was tied in a simple bun, her face lined with wrinkles, and her eyes expressed deep sorrow. She was speaking quietly with Maria, and Father Giovanni was already up, busying himself in the corner, not interfering with their conversation. Marco and Deacon Luca were still asleep, recovering from the intense night. I approached Father Giovanni and quietly asked, "Who is that woman?" The priest turned to me and, tilting his head slightly, replied, "That's Maria's mother, Angelina." I glanced at the mother and daughter. It was clear the conversation was heavy. Angelina was crying, tears streaming down her face, while Maria, still weak, tried to comfort her, whispering words of reassurance. When their conversation ended, Angelina stood up and, approaching us quietly, said, "Thank you, Father, for helping my daughter." Father Giovanni responded with a gentle smile. "It is our duty before God and people, Angelina. But if we want to save your daughter, we need to know the truth. Do you know why the demon possessed her?" Angelina hesitated, her hands trembling. It was clear she was wrestling with whether or not to speak, her face showing the internal struggle. Father Giovanni gently but firmly said, "Her life depends on this. You must tell the truth." Tears streamed down her face again, and she sighed heavily before whispering, "I don't know the full truth, but my mother once warned us. She said our family was cursed, long ago in the past, but I didn't believe her. And now, with what's happened to my daughter, I tried to learn more, but my mother, the old hag, refuses to speak the truth." Angelina fell silent, lowering her head. It was clear that this confession had cost her dearly. Father Giovanni nodded, his gaze deep and thoughtful. "It's a small clue, but it might help. Thank you, Angelina." She nodded silently, then quietly said goodbye and left the house. The priest returned to his tasks, and I decided it was time to put my journalistic skills to work and dig deeper into this case. I informed the others that I was going to the village to question the locals. Perhaps they knew more than they were willing to admit. On my way to the village, I decided to replay the recording on my recorder, hoping I could listen more carefully to everything that happened during the night. I rewound the tape and started listening. At first, it seemed like nothing unusual. The same screams, prayers, and rustling sounds I had already heard. All the noises remained the same, as did my own commentary on the recording. But suddenly, when I reached the part where Maria started screaming, I noticed something strange. Among her screams, another voice broke through. It was raspy, low, as if someone or something beyond human perception was speaking. The words came out fragmented, as if spoken through a thick veil. I stopped, listening with growing unease. It was hard to make out exactly what was being said, but soon one word became clear. It was a name, a man's Italian name, Alessandro. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment I froze in place. The sun was shining brightly. The day was warm and cloudless, but it felt as if darkness was closing in around me. The voice was sinister, and its nature was distinctly inhuman. I didn't know what to think, but my body instinctively reacted to the fear that gripped me. I listened to the rest of the tape, but there were no more strange sounds or voices. The voice saying Alessandro was the only anomaly on the recording. I turned off the recorder and continued my way, contemplating what had happened. Soon I arrived at the village. Life here carried on, though, with a palpable sense of unease in the air. I saw a few people going about their business, but their faces were wary. It wasn't the usual hustle and bustle of village life. It seemed as though everyone was trying to move faster, spending as little time outdoors as possible, as if even the daylight couldn't provide full protection. My attention was drawn to a woman working in a nearby garden. Her movements were quick and purposeful, as though she wanted to finish her work as soon as possible. I approached her and greeted her. "Hello." She flinched and turned around sharply, looking at me with startled eyes. Her gaze was filled with anxiety, and for a moment I sensed that she didn't want to speak with me. But after a brief pause, she greeted me in return. "Hello." I introduced myself. "I'm a reporter. I'm writing a story about your village." My words seemed to calm her a little. She sighed heavily, glancing around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. There are terrible things happening here," she whispered, continuing to work in the garden, though her voice was tinged with fear. "You've probably heard already. There's a monster in the area. People are afraid. They don't leave their homes unless necessary, and they talk less to each other. Every day they're afraid of attracting its attention." I asked her if she knew where this creature had come from. "No, I don't know," she replied quietly, without looking up from her work. Then I asked another question, one that had been on my mind for some time. "And what can you tell me about Signora Anna Giraldi?" The woman abruptly turned her head toward me, her face suddenly suspicious. She frowned, narrowing her eyes, and asked, "What do you want to know about them? Do you suspect something? I've never liked that family. Are they involved in this?" I quickly waved my hands, trying to dispel her suspicions. No, I don't suspect them. I'm just researching the history of local families, and I'm particularly interested in that one." The woman relaxed a little, but still watched me with caution. "I see. Well, they're quite wealthy. I don't know much about Signora Anna personally. You'd have to ask my mother." She nodded toward the house and led me inside. When we entered the house, I was immediately greeted by the smell of old wooden beams mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed tea. The house was simple but cozy, with massive wooden beams on the ceiling and old-fashioned furniture. In the corner, by the window, sat an old woman in a rocking chair. She was very old, her skin like parchment, and her hands trembled with age. But there was a spark of wisdom and experience in her eyes. The woman I had been speaking with approached her and, leaning in, said, "Mama, there's a man here. He wants to ask you what you know about Signora Anna Giraldi." The old woman remained silent at first, as if processing what she'd just heard. Then, after a few moments, she lifted her head and slowly responded. "Yes, I know her well. That girl used to run through my garden stealing apples. Little rascal." She chuckled, as if reliving a distant memory. What do you want to know? Did anything strange happen with her? I asked, not wasting any time. The old woman paused for a moment, her gaze clouding over as she seemed to drift into memories. Then she began to speak, almost as if addressing someone far away rather than us. She had a friend. They were inseparable. But both of them fell in love with the same man. He was wealthy, successful, and was also trying to choose between them. I thought he would choose Francesca. The old woman's voice trembled slightly as she said the name. Francesca, I thought. But something about the story didn't sit right with me, so I asked, "And what happened to her?" Francesca. She died suddenly. Fell from a cliff. They found her deep in a ravine. A tragic death for the whole village, the old woman continued, sighing heavily. And then Alessandro married Anna. My heart skipped a beat when I heard that name. Sorry, what was his name? I asked. Alessandro Giraldi, she repeated, not noticing my shock. There it was. Now things were starting to make more sense. It was the same name I had heard on the recorder. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck, but I continued asking questions, trying to stay calm. And how did Francesca die? She fell from the cliff. The old woman repeated again, her voice full of sorrow. They found her down in the ravine. It was a tragic death. No one knew how it happened, but people said her death was unusual. There were no witnesses, no explanations. So Anna married Alessandro, I clarified, trying to digest what I was hearing. And where is he now? The old woman slowly shook her head, and the woman I had been speaking to earlier added, Alessandro and Fabio, Angelina's husband, both died in a car accident many years ago. Since then, there have only been 4 of them in the family. Maria married Marco, and now they live with the 3 of them. The only man left in the family is Angelina's son, Lorenzo. I see, I said, understanding that the puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place. The situation was gradually becoming clearer. After a brief conversation, I thanked them for their help and left the house. As I made my way back, my mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts. The name Alessandro had resurfaced so unexpectedly, and the story of Francesca left a strange feeling. Perhaps this was no mere coincidence. When I returned to the estate, the atmosphere was tense. I immediately heard 2 men arguing. It was Marco and someone else I hadn't seen before. Their voices filled the courtyard, breaking the silence. They were fiercely arguing, their gestures sharp and their words cutting. The stranger soon left, throwing out one final contemptuous remark before disappearing around the corner of the house. I approached Marco, who looked agitated, his face red with anger. Who was that? I asked, unable to hide my curiosity. Marco sighed heavily, trying to calm himself. That was Lorenzo, he replied bitterly. Maria's brother. What did he want? I pressed. Marco looked away, clenching his fists. He's blaming me for what happened to Maria. Says it's all my fault, that I'm the reason this is happening. And... His voice trembled. He said he's going to take her away. Take her as soon as he can. Listening to him, I began to think. It seemed that with each passing day, this family became stranger and more mysterious. I left Marco, who was clearly struggling to keep his emotions in check, and went to find Father Giovanni. When I told him everything I had learned, about the voice on the recording, about what I had found out from the old woman in the village, the priest listened attentively, then nodded gratefully. You've done good work, he said quietly. Tonight we will attempt the exorcism. Then perhaps things will become clearer. I nodded in agreement and began to wait for nightfall. When darkness once again blanketed the village, we began the preparations. Maria was tied up again, just like last time. But this time there was an air of tension, much thicker and more unsettling. Candles were lit around the perimeter of the room, casting long, ominous shadows on the walls. I sat in my corner, watching, feeling the fear creeping back into my thoughts. Marco sat beside the bed, his hands trembling, but he was trying to remain calm. Father Giovanni stood at the foot of the bed, holding a prayer book in one hand and a crucifix in the other. His face was focused, and his lips moved silently, preparing for the ritual. Deacon Luca stood next to him, holding a vessel of holy water, ready to assist at any moment. By midnight, the wind outside had picked up, and strange knocking sounds could be heard through the walls of the house, as if something unseen was wandering outside. Father Giovanni seemed to pay no attention. He continued reciting prayers, his voice growing louder, filled with determination and strength. His words seemed to cut through the air, creating an invisible shield around us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, he began with resolve in his voice. Lord, free your servant from all evil. His voice sounded like a call into the void, as though he was summoning something deeply hidden. Unclean spirit, leave this creation of God, he declared firmly. We ask you, Almighty God, by your power and mercy, to drive out this demon. Marco sat beside his wife, holding her hand, silently whispering his own prayers, and I could see his lips trembling. Deacon Luca gently sprinkled Maria with holy water as her body began to tremble slightly, as if something inside her was stirring. Almighty Lord, by your grace, protect this soul, Father Giovanni continued, lifting the cross above Maria. Grant us power over demons and illnesses, so that we may cast out this evil spirit. Maria twitched, her eyes flickering beneath her closed eyelids, as though she was battling something within. Father Giovanni didn't relent, his voice growing louder as he approached the climax of the ritual. In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you. His voice cut through the air like lightning. Reveal yourself. Say your name. He lifted the cross even higher, his voice booming. Tell us your name, demon. A moment of silence followed his command. It felt as though time had stopped. The air was thick with tension, palpable on the skin. The girl suddenly arched her back as if her body was trying to break free from its own bonds. Her movements were unnatural, contorting at strange angles as if her joints no longer obeyed the laws of nature. Her face turned red, and her eyes widened so much it seemed they would pop out of their sockets. The veins in her neck bulged, pulsing as though a fierce battle for control over her body was raging inside. She suddenly opened her mouth and let out a guttural growl, then roared, "Zoltar!" The horrifying roar sent chills down my spine, and my heart pounded as if it were about to leap from my chest. The entire room filled with this terrible sound which seemed to tear the very air apart. Father Giovanni, though his face had turned pale, stood firm. His voice trembled, but he continued. In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, I command you, Demon Zoltar, to leave this body. You have no power here. Leave this soul and return to the abyss. His words were like commands cutting through the howling wind that suddenly rushed into the room. The windows flew open with a crash, as if someone had forcefully flung them open from the inside, and the gust of wind swept through the space. The candles flickered, their flames growing restless, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The shadows seemed to move on their own, becoming more and more terrifying. Outside, dull thuds could be heard, as if someone was prowling around, trying to break in. Objects in the room began to move on their own. Books fell from the shelves. Chairs creaked and swayed as if an invisible force was touching them. I watched in horror, my mind scrambling to find an explanation, but fear had taken such a hold of me that it felt like nothing could help. I wanted to tear the prayer book from the priest's hands and start praying myself, just to make this nightmare stop. Maria continued to growl and thrash on the bed, but then her body began to change. I saw the muscles in her arms swell, bulging as they grew rough like those of a wild beast. Her fingers bent, and her nails began to extend, turning into claws. Maria's head started to elongate, her features shifting into something more animalistic. Her cheekbones widened, and her face stretched into a long, wolf-like snout. Her eyes took on a menacing amber hue, filled with a beastly rage. Dark, thick fur began to sprout all over her body, covering her from head to toe. Her body expanded, muscles rippling and tearing beneath her skin as if she was no longer human. The sight was so horrifying that even the priests, who had remained steadfast until that moment, stepped back. Father Giovanni froze for a moment, and Deacon Luca, pale, let go of the holy water, nearly dropping it. Marco, driven mad by fear, backed away from the bed, his face a mask of indescribable terror. Before us was no longer Maria. Before us stood a monster, a massive, fur-covered creature lying on the bed, but the chains barely held it. She growled with such fury that the entire room echoed with the sound. It was the most terrifying sight I had ever witnessed. She looked at us with those inhuman eyes filled with beastly rage and hatred. Then she began making strange noises like barking. But amid those guttural sounds, I discerned a name. Alessandro. She repeated the name over and over, as if cursing it, growling and gnashing her teeth. Suddenly the creature growled even louder, its muscles tensed, and with incredible strength it broke the chains that had held it. The beast stood on the bed, its gaze filled with hatred. Father Giovanni, pale, held the cross before him, continuing to pray, "Lord, protect us. Give us the strength to banish this evil." The creature stood, glaring at the priest, as if preparing to attack. Its chest heaved, claws digging into the bed. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move. But in the next moment, with incredible speed, the creature leapt and crashed through the window, shattering it into pieces. We all stood frozen, unable to move, while the cold wind lashed at us, as if trying to wake us from the shock. Silence blanketed the room, but the terror lingered. It had paralyzed us, preventing even the slightest movement. Suddenly, Father Giovanni collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. I rushed to him, as did the others, alarmed by his sudden weakness. Father Giovanni looked up at us, his face pale and exhausted. "This demon is too strong," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I should have realized it sooner. This is my fault. It might already be too late." After that, he fell silent, lost in thought, as if searching for a solution or praying silently. His words sounded like a confession of guilt, and it added even more weight to the situation. I stood there contemplating his words, and then it hit me. The name the creature had uttered, Alessandro. It was heading to the Giraldi house. Marco heard this, and as if snapping out of the shock, he realized what I was saying. We quickly ran outside, racing towards the village, desperate to warn Maria's family before it was too late. Father Giovanni called after us to wait for him, but we were too consumed by urgency and fear. There was no time for hesitation. When we reached the Giraldi house, a horrifying scene awaited us. One of the windows had been smashed, shards of glass scattered on the ground. silently attesting to the chaos that had occurred. We rushed inside, fearing the worst. The living room was eerily quiet, but the silence made our blood run cold. We stopped, horrified at the sight unfolding before us. In the center of the room stood the creature, the same one that had once been Maria, but now it had fully transformed into a beast. Its eyes blazed with animalistic rage, and bloodstains gleamed on its fur. It stood still, as if surveying its handiwork. Nearby, in the middle of the room, knelt the elderly woman, Anna, cradling the mutilated bodies of her daughter Angelina and grandson Lorenzo. They had been torn apart, their bodies covered in bloody wounds and shredded clothing. The old woman clutched them, sobbing quietly, her tears mixing with the blood. The room was filled with a dreadful atmosphere, as if everything had frozen, like a nightmare come to life. In the corner, a dim lamp still flickered, casting a weak light on the horrifying scene. I felt a chill pierce my heart. It seemed as though reality itself had warped, and I had descended into some kind of living hell. The creature suddenly noticed us. It lifted its head sharply, its eyes blazing, and let out a roar. With incredible speed, it lunged toward us, but then, as if changing its mind, leapt toward the window, smashing through the remaining glass in an explosion of shards. We stood there, paralyzed by fear, unable to move. The creature vanished into the darkness, leaving us with a sense of utter devastation. A few minutes later, Father Giovanni and Deacon Luca caught up with us. All four of us stood in silence, not knowing what to say. The old woman, Anna, continued to weep, mourning over the bodies of her children. Her voice was filled with sorrow and despair, and every tear was steeped in pain. I approached her, feeling that this was the last chance to uncover the truth. The name Francesca echoed in my mind. I knelt beside the old woman and quietly asked, "What did you do to Francesca?" The old woman looked at me sharply, her eyes flashing with rage. She screamed, no longer able to hold back her emotions. "Yes, I killed her." Her voice was filled with hatred and bitterness. "I pushed her off the cliff. She cursed me before she died, but I couldn't let Alessandro go to her. I loved him." Her face twisted in anger and she began to curse, damning her friend Francesca, crying and shouting. Her voice trembled with hatred, but it was the voice of a broken, shattered person. I glanced at Marco. His face was contorted with despair. He didn't know what to do next. I quietly left and went to call the police. The next day, the entire village knew what had happened. The deaths of Angelina and Lorenzo shook the villagers, but the fear continued to linger in the air, like a shadow that refused to leave. People whispered among themselves, but no one dared step outside after sunset. I asked Father Giovanni what would happen next. He sighed heavily, and his face grew more serious than ever. "I've sent a message to the Vatican," he said quietly. "We're awaiting a response. Something is bound to happen soon. For now, we stay here. That creature is hiding somewhere in the forests, in the mountains. We must be prepared." Marco sat off to the side, his face blank, devoid of any hope. It seemed like he had finally broken under the weight of everything that had happened. I couldn't blame him. It seemed there was no saving Maria. Even I had begun to understand that her soul was lost. And yet, this horror haunted me, compelling me to keep searching for answers. Later in the evening, something unexpected happened. From the trees, like shadows, emerged several figures, clad in long, dark cloaks with hoods that concealed their faces. They were tall and moved silently, as if they were dissolving into the twilight. Their faces were hidden behind masks, making it impossible to tell who they were. Only their eyes gleamed from under the masks, cold and lifeless. I approached her, feeling that this was the last chance to uncover the truth. The name Francesca echoed in my mind. I knelt beside the old woman and quietly asked, "What did you do to Francesca?" The old woman looked at me sharply, her eyes flashing with rage. She screamed, no longer able to hold back her emotions. "Yes, I killed her." Her voice was filled with hatred and bitterness. "I pushed her off the cliff. She cursed me before she died, but I couldn't let Alessandro go to her. I loved him." Her face twisted in anger and she began to curse, damning her friend Francesca, crying and shouting. Her voice trembled with hatred, but it was the voice of a broken, shattered person. I glanced at Marco. His face was contorted with despair. He didn't know what to do next. I quietly left and went to call the police. The next day, the entire village knew what had happened. The deaths of Angelina and Lorenzo shook the villagers, but the fear continued to linger in the air, like a shadow that refused to leave. People whispered among themselves, but no one dared step outside after sunset. I asked Father Giovanni what would happen next. He sighed heavily, and his face grew more serious than ever. "I've sent a message to the Vatican," he said quietly. "We're awaiting a response. Something is bound to happen soon. For now, we stay here. That creature is hiding somewhere in the forests, in the mountains. We must be prepared." Marco sat off to the side, his face blank, devoid of any hope. It seemed like he had finally broken under the weight of everything that had happened. I couldn't blame him. It seemed there was no saving Maria. Even I had begun to understand that her soul was lost. And yet, this horror haunted me, compelling me to keep searching for answers. Later in the evening, something unexpected happened. From the trees, like shadows, emerged several figures, clad in long, dark cloaks with hoods that concealed their faces. They were tall and moved silently, as if they were dissolving into the twilight. Their faces were hidden behind masks, making it impossible to tell who they were. Only their eyes gleamed from under the masks, cold and lifeless. They arrived without a word and immediately approached Father Giovanni. I watched as they spoke to him in hushed tones. Even from a distance, I could sense that these people were not ordinary priests. They radiated an aura of mystery and power that sent a chill down my spine. When their conversation ended, they disappeared just as silently, heading toward the mountains. I couldn't help but ask Father Giovanni, "Who are those people?" The priest looked at me calmly, but his gaze was full of unspoken thoughts. "That's a secret," he said, and his tone left no room for further questions. I understood there was no point in asking more. At dawn, they returned. This time they were carrying something. As they came closer, I saw that it was a body. It was wrapped in a simple blanket, but I immediately knew it was Maria. They handed over the body to us, as if it was the final act of a completed mission. When Marco saw his wife, he collapsed to his knees, his scream filled with grief and despair. He wept, his body shaking as though he was losing his entire life with her. The rest of us stood in silence, allowing him to grieve in his own way. The mysterious figures once again whispered to Father Giovanni before turning and disappearing into the forest, as if they had never been there. I watched them go, trying to comprehend who they were and how they had managed to deal with the creature. It all seemed unreal, as if I were a character in someone's nightmare. I suspected they belonged to some kind of order, perhaps tied to the ancient secrets of the church. but I had no concrete answers. I approached Father Giovanni and asked, could Maria have been saved? The priest was silent for a long time, his head bowed, before he quietly replied, she had fully transformed. We had no other choice. Her soul was lost. After that, the funeral took place. It was a day of farewell and silence. We buried Maria in the village cemetery, and the village once again sank into darkness. I returned home, but the horror of what had happened stayed with me for a long time. For many years I wondered whether I should publish this story, but I knew no one would believe me. This article would have ruined my reputation and destroyed everything I had achieved in my career. So I decided to keep it a secret until now. Only now, after retiring and no longer fearing for my reputation, can I reveal the truth about these terrifying events. This story turned my life upside down, and I know it will never leave my thoughts. As for Marco, after everything that happened, he left the village and never returned. I don't know what became of him, but I hope he found peace somewhere far from these mountains. The old woman, Anna, who had lost her entire family, went mad and soon died alone. Recently, in my old age, I visited the village again. The Giraldi house still stands, overgrown and forgotten. No one wants to live there anymore, and it has become a symbol of fear and abandonment.